This week, coming on the show is Kevin Kelly. He has a new book coming out, which we're going to talk about. And this is great for me. I've just been super excited and a little nervous because I have been reading Kevin's work for, at least 15 or so years now. Kevin is, if you don't know of Kevin, you definitely know of his work. He is one of the co-founders of Wired magazine. He is a co-founder of the Quantified Self Movement. And he also serves on the board of the Long Now Foundation, which we've touched on a bit in the past episodes of On Books. I came to Kevin's work in a few different ways. I think it was all at the same time, right around 2000, I think it was. And his writing, his book, Out of Control, his first book, was required reading for all the actors on the set of The Matrix. And I, at that time, I loved the movie The Matrix and would read anything, any kind of philosophy around the movie. I was in a philosophy of technology class, and I was reading books that the Wachowski brothers had written. I was just so inspired by the philosophy of that movie, and his book was on that list. So that it came to me that way. And around the same time, he was also on This American Life. So he was on This American Life, which is to this day one of my favorite This American Life stories, where Kevin tells the story of he's in his early or mid-20s, I think, and he's traveling around the world and is led to have an epiphany about life. I'll just leave it at that. I'm just not going to go too into it. But this moment of clarity that he has leads him to make a decision that he should live his next 6 months of his life as if it were the last 6 months that he had on this planet. He was just convinced that this is the way he needed to live the rest of the year. And so in doing that, he asked himself a lot of questions about what it means to own things and do things in life. And during that, he gives away all of his possessions and rides his bike across the country. And This American Life story, I'll put a link to it in the show notes. It's just so inspirational. So, wow. I mean, there's so many things you can tell that Kevin has done in his life from working, writing with Stuart Brand as part of the Counterculture movement, predicting the internet with his book Out of Control. He was blogging in the late 80s. Who blogs in the late 80s, right? Like years before it even had a name. He was probably one of the first live bloggers on The Well, which was one of the first online communities. Needless to say, I'm just was super excited to have this chat. And I think the chat went really, really great. We talked about his book, The Inevitable, which is coming out. I got an early copy of it. And in the next episode of On Books, I'm going to read a bit from it and give you some of my favorite takeaways. But this book, The Inevitable, the main premise of this, and that we'll talk about, is that much of what will happen in the next 30 years, basically, so from now to the next 30 years, is inevitable. That's what Kevin Kelly is saying. So he's saying there are certain things that are inevitable. There's at least these 12 things that he outlines in the book. And if we embrace these as opposed to fight them, then our day-to-day relationships with technology and business and our mind will all make a lot more sense. And so that's what the book's about. It's really brilliant, and it just came out this week, so I'd recommend it. So I'm really happy for Kevin. He got the book out. People seem to be loving it. For example, David Pogue wrote of the book. He said, anyone can claim to be a prophet, a fortune teller, a futurist, and plenty of people do. But what makes Kevin Kelly different is that he's right. And Mark Andreessen gave a review of the book and wrote, automatic must read. So yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's a great book, and Kevin's here. He's here today to talk about the book and so much more. So in this episode of On Books, Kevin and I will be talking about the counterculture movement of the 60s. That's something that's been on my mind a lot. The way that counterculture about 40 years ago really informed, where we are today on the internet. There's a huge connection, and Kevin was there writing about it on the front lines, and he's going to share some stories with us. It's amazing. He's going to share some stories about how you can use travel as an act of rebellion and using travel as a way to open and really free your mind, some of his tips and how that pours into his writing about technology. Of course, we're going to talk about the book, The Inevitable, and Kevin is a voracious reader, and so I was curious to learn some of his lessons on how he reads so many books a year. So he's going to give us some tips on how to read better, as well as he'll answer my question, what book do you wish everyone in the world read to make the world a better place. And he has one of the best answers for that I've heard so far. So that and so much more, stay tuned. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Kevin Kelly. I've read that you grew up in New Jersey as well, huh?
I did. I grew up in Westfield, New Jersey, which are technically the Westfields of Elizabeth, not very far from New York City. My dad worked in New York City, so Westfield was at that time a kind of a bedroom commute suburb, and but it's northern New Jersey, not the pretty part as far as I'm concerned of New Jersey, which has many pretty parts. So I left as soon as I could, and where I left to basically was Asia. So I really haven't been back very much to New Jersey, and haven't really explored very much. But Asia was sort of where I went instead of going to college. I went to Asia, and that has been much more formative on me than anything else, I think.
Before you left, where did you think, or what did you think was going to be in Asia?
It's hard to kind of reconstruct how parochial life in the United States was in the 1960s or in 50s when I grew up in the 60s. I had I'd eaten in a restaurant, I think, twice in my life, and I'd never had Chinese food ever. I met one Chinese person. Food was, the kind of archetypical white people food of meatloaf and spaghetti and stuff. But I had a friend of my father's who was in the war and served in the Pacific, and was on the first boat that landed in Japan after dropping the bombs.
Wow.
And he was, as they all were, terrified of what they would encounter, and then was blown away and transformed by what they did. So they found the Japanese to be these kind of amazingly civilized people in a kind of weird way, and he fell in love with Japan and eventually married a Japanese woman. And he would come back and tell stories about Japan and crazy things like going to Japanese baseball games and what the subways were like. And I accumulated notions of it because other than National Geographic, there was no TV about Asia. There was no books, no magazines. There was no travel guides. I mean, there was no information. There had no preconceptions other than these stories. And so when I did finally go overseas, I went over for two reasons. One was because my best friend from high school was studying Chinese in Taiwan, and he invited me over, and I wanted to see Japan because of the stories I heard. So I wanted to be a photographer, National Geographic photographer, and I set off after calling National Geographic and telling them I was about to go. And there was no tourists in any of these places. I took a freighter from Taiwan to Japan. I hitchhiked through Japan, and it was in this early 1970, 71. It was not very long after the war, and there were very traditional places, and I saw two things. One is everything happens out in the open. They have a very different sense of privacy, so everything was kind of happening on the street. You get a complete picture of how things worked, how things were made, how things were done. And secondly, I got a really bad case of optimism because I could see people transforming themselves, lifting themselves out of poverty right before my eyes. And
in Japan,
in Japan, in Taiwan. So you go buy a little rice paddy with water buffalo in it, and then 6 months later they'd have a the little tractor, and then a year later there'd be like concrete homes.
Oh, it sounds like a startup scene a little bit these days or something.
Exactly, right. It was the speed of the transformation was incredible. Of course, that has been going on now for almost 40 years. And, that's why you have places like in China, Shenzhen, which was at that time literally just a little fishing village and is now the city larger than New York. And that happened, again, within visible sight. You could just see this happening. So that's what I got from Asia, although I didn't really have any idea about any of that when I left.
When you did leave, because it sounds like, you were from New Jersey, and I can relate to the meatloaf and, not really meeting a Chinese person and everything you're saying. Did it seem completely radical to your friends that you were just going to like leave New Jersey, leave the United States and go on this trip?
I guess so, but I after high school, I did photography kind of on my own, and I did a workshop, and I guess I didn't. I was self-sufficient, I guess you would say, kind of hippie-ish, and so it fit into the hippie model of. And there were some drifters, so I think it wasn't as. I mean, there was a role. There was a archetypical role that I could be slotted into, which was the 1970s hippie drifter, and there were definitely the backpacker.
Oh yeah.
And so it wasn't like it wasn't completely by myself in that sense. And there, in fact, were a very small band of very hardy backpackers who were on the road. There were very few of them were Americans, most of them were Australians and Europeans, but there was enough to actually have that view, because this was basically the early 70s was the peak of the hippie, and so I had a long beard and plaid shirts and stuff. So I fit into that slot, and so people could kind of explain me away that way.
Is that I've read the book by Fred Turner, From Counterculture to Cyberculture. Is what you're talking about? Is that during the age of counterculture? Like, is this all part of that movement?
Yeah.
Okay. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Well, so the counterculture was a reaction to many things. There were many strands, and there were many kind of species of them. There was a reaction to the war machine, not just the specific war, Vietnam War in the U.S., but just the whole militarization. And there was a reaction to the organizational this kind of corporatization that was going on and becoming very, very robust.
What did that look like?
The reaction was, the big corporations, when you're kind of the gray suited cog and you're just in this hierarchy and you're kind of the clerk pushing paper or trying to sell things. And the factories had the same metaphor of, you're just, and people who worked in the factory were kind of like machines. And so there was this association with a career in which the advice, the reigning advice at the time was, work for a big corporation, don't rock the boat, just go somewhere where it's secure.
Oh, okay.
Get a job at IBM, and you don't have to worry. And in fact, what's in retrospect very curious is if you met someone and they told you that they were starting up their own business or something, that was code for I'm unemployed.
Oh, that still is sometimes, but I know what you mean.
Well, I know, but I mean, there was absolutely no honor in that. That was a total second class thing to do. There was no heroes, there was no glory in doing a startup. That was like someone telling you they're going to start a restaurant. It's like, good luck. There were people who did it, but they were really against all. They were really fighting against the grain, because the grain was you worked for an established company. There was no 20-year-old who went and said, I want to start my own business.
Yeah.
Nobody.
Yeah.
The only people who actually eventually did that, again, coming out of the counterculture, were the hippies. And so the hippies were saying, I don't want to work for the big man. So they was like, well, how are you going to make business? Well, they started to sell candles or macrame. And they actually, again, against the grain, were doing small businesses, but they weren't calling it that. They were doing crafts or whatever. They were but they actually were learning the most essential skill, which was how to do a business, how to sell something for more than you. And so it was those hippies actually who later on went to do the startups. And a lot of the startups were long-haired guys who were doing coding and starting businesses and they were doing it because they had actually not studied it as an MBA, which you don't really learn anything about business, but actually had done selling things at a craft fair or whatever. They had some experience in the general dynamics. And so they inadvertently, the hippies counterculture, because they weren't participating in the big corporations, they were having to do these little businesses that people were, they were even ashamed to call them businesses, but that's what they were. And they were actually gaining these skills that, regular normal people would not be caught dead doing, because it was not considered, there was no status in that at that time.
So in all of this, were you driven to do photography or to write? Like, how did you react personally to that?
Yeah, well, going back to there, and part of the kind of the hippie thing, besides honoring doing your own little business, was travel, and as an education, and there was a whole contingent of, instead of people living on the farm, there was the people who were buying the VW bus and driving around as nomads, and kind of not being, committed down or tied down to a particular job. They were freelancing. This whole idea of, the freelance nation, the idea of being your own boss. They were own boss, picking up odd jobs, living in a school bus or a converted van, seeing the world, getting educated, inventing their lives, which was the whole Kellogg version. And there was a small contingent who kind of went overseas, those who went down to Mexico and beyond, or hitchhiking like I was doing, or they were in Europe hitchhiking around with very little money, lots of time. And that was, they were part of this sort of subculture of people who kind of like had dropped out, were not pursuing careers.
Right, yeah.
And were making their own way and inadvertently learning these very essential skills. They're kind of like we're on a permanent gap year, and we're actually sort of learning more useful skills in a certain sense than people who were going through college or signing up to work at IBM or General Motors, whatever it was. And
just kind of haphazardly, or did they, it didn't seem like they really had a plan to do that. It kind of just came out of...
No, it wasn't. There was, it just came out of basic,
of it.
Survival. But it was just like, this is sort of what you're supposed to do because this makes a better person. And I think that was the general, what I would believe, to say, no, you are assembling your own life, inventing your own life, and these are good skills to have just because they make you a better person, not because they're going to make you more money. I mean, I fully expected to be, never to have a career, to always be having more time than money, and that was sort of
cool.
what I was signing up for.
I like that.
And I think that was what a lot of the hippie colleagues, they were resigning for a quality of life rather than a quantity of life.
That's amazing. Yeah, it's funny how much I think I take for granted. I grew up in the 80s, and I don't know, the things you're talking about now as far as like the ability to travel. I don't know. It's funny. It's funny to think that was such a rebellious thing, and now people will sometimes take a gap year, or
right.
all that
Yeah,
kind of stuff.
This was. I mean, you could have counted on one hand the number of foreigners that might have been in the country at the same time.
Oh, wow.
I mean, I traveled for 5 months in Japan, and I did not see one single other foreigner at that time. So that was a very. I mean, it's in retrospect because it was a perfect time to travel in one way, and that was previous to the 1970s, say 60s, to kind of travel in the remote parts of the world required almost like an expedition. You had to hire your own vehicle and porters, and there was very little hotels or even restaurants in a lot of countries because eating out was not part of the culture. And so you had to be very self-sufficient and required kind of a lot of organization and a certain amount of wealth to do it. And then, of course, on this side of the 70s, anybody can buy, a plane ticket, a bus ticket to anywhere in the world, and you could rent a car almost and drive yourself to anywhere you want in the world, even very remote places. But of course, pre-70s, there was very little development, so things were almost as they had been for centuries, or medieval. They were kind of these time machines. And of course now they're much less so. Everybody has cell phones, and they're looking at the same things that you're looking at home. But there was this moment that was right in between in the 70s for like a brief decade or less, when someone like me who had very little money could take a newly run bus into these areas that were still a time machine. You didn't need an expedition. You could just buy a cheap bus ticket and get there.
Yeah.
But when you got there, things had not changed in centuries. There was no signs, there was no electricity, there was no TV, there was nothing except what had been there. And but you didn't need an expedition, so it's like a poor hippie traveler with a backpack and nothing else could arrive there. And so it was a time machine. It was a cheap, almost free time machine. Now you can get these places, but they've radically changed and they become developed. So there was this moment when the hippie clan, like me, with their backpacks, had this amazing trips where, like in Nepal or Afghanistan or somewhere, or Morocco, you were arriving at these places that had literally not changed in centuries. And you had very little money, but man, you were seeing things as if you had traveled back in time. And that actually was also formative to me because I saw what life was like really without technology.
Yes.
I could really see you did not want
what was it
to
like?
live there. I mean, I mean, there were medieval in every senses of the word, but for the structure of the society, the role of women, to how things operated, to the physical infrastructure where people basically crapped in the streets because there was no plumbing. They threw garbage out the window. They were cold and drafty. Their only light was the fire. It was smoky and damp.
And this is most of Asia, or any place in particular? You're...
A lot of Asia.
Yeah.
Outside of the cities.
There
was in many cases, like Myanmar, there was no restaurants. There was only ox carts to take you around. It was it was very clear that you weren't going to stay there, and that at least I had very very quickly unromanticized these things. They look very charming, and there's a lot that I would celebrate about them. There's a lot that's being lost. I'm recording those right now. I'm going back in Asia and photographing these things that are disappearing.
Oh, wow.
Because they have disappeared, but I have no nostalgia about living like that because it's tough. People die really young. There's lots of TB, lots of disease. That was endemic. And of course, the whole you definitely do not want to be female born in there as a girl because you did all the work.
Yeah.
So these are the things that I came away with, was saying that it's like technology, good, really good. There's costs, there's consequences, there's a price that we're going to pay.
Sure.
But even paying the price, there's a net gain in having electricity, having running water, having air conditioning, having lights, having Twitter, having VR. These are all things that will be a net gain.
Wow. And that's something that, I probably could never even see anymore. Maybe there's some remote parts of the world. But
there are actually. I've been trying to go back, and there are some places. And if you want some tips about where you can see that, I can direct you to those places, which again are amazingly. You can buy your plane and bus ticket, and you can be there in 24 hours. You can be in a place that hasn't changed very much, although they will have cell phones.
What's one place, for example?
In, say, northern Myanmar.
Yeah.
Okay. Northern Myanmar.
Yeah.
There are places in I would say some places in Nepal.
Nepal, yeah.
Where that you have to walk into. There are interesting. There are some valleys in China that are still pretty remote. On the Tibetan, on the steppes, the lower, not the Tibet Autonomous Region, but the Chinese. It's hard to explain, but there's the on the east side of Tibet. There's some valleys that are still pretty remote and not cool. Westernized yet. There are even portions of India that are still feel like time machines.
Wow! So it sounds like you travel a lot still. Clearly,
I do.
Yeah,
I do.
Huh? That's amazing.
Because I think that there's nothing to keep your mind flexible and nimble like travel.
Yeah. How so?
It forces you to, at least forces me to keep changing my mind, to confront otherness and to see, if you travel kind of a little bit raw, close to the ground, local level, it forces you to confront others and to see things through a different perspective, which is both good in itself. The new perspective is interesting, but also just that habit of trying to change your perspective is very, very valuable, because the most difficult thing to do now in a very connected world is think different.
Yeah.
It's not hard to think different if you're not connected.
Yeah.
But if you're not connected and thinking different, your thinking different doesn't really mean very much. To have any consequence, you have to be connected. but remaining to think differently while you're connected is very difficult because the tendency is to think like everybody else. And so I find travel helps me think different while being connected.
Yeah, it seems like it's so interesting that there is like a conformity of the network, right? Or it seems like there could be, where if everybody's just doing the same thing, in Out of Control, in your first book, you mentioned the swarm and the hive mind. And for people listening, think about the way of a flock of birds kind of follows together. There is that conformity, and it's interesting to think about how do you still find that if, because you're talking about travel, but if you go to like Bangkok and you just, that's a part of Asia, but you could go there and you could have a very westernized experience and not think differently. So it's becoming more of a challenge.
Yeah, it is. You have to work a little harder. I have this, my travel advice is what I call I call it laserback. It's not a very good title, but.
Okay, what's that?
So it's very practical advice, which I use all the time and have done by myself, with my family, with large groups. And that is that I pick some kind of remote destination that's usually based around a passion. So it's better to travel around passions rather than destinations. So you pick out something that you are kind of like interested in, beekeeping, I don't know, dinosaurs, cheese making, weaving, or something. Or oftentimes there's somebody or something that you see in an obscure village. Anyway, the idea is you go directly from landing at the airport to the remotest destination that you're going to go in your time. Immediately, do not pass go, do not stop overnight, do not acclimatize, just go directly there, and then wind your way back to the capital city to fly out. And there's several things that happen during that process. One is that you arrive at the maximum otherness right away, and so you have this. You're confronted. You're dealing with the otherness, and you also, because it's kind of out of the big city and very different. Mistakes are actually cheaper out there, so you don't know how much things cost. So, but everything is more forgivable, and you can kind of adjust to the going ways less expensively and easier. And then, as you're kind of making your way back, what happens is that you kind of recapitulate the journey of all the millions of people who are making the journey from the villages into the city, because by the time you get to the capital city, you are just so ready for the lights and the air conditioning, the food. You see it in the same way that the country bumpkins do, which is like this amazing, it's a city, and you're ready for it, and it doesn't look the same. It looks just marvelous, and you can actually kind of appreciate the differences. And so it works. So instead of being kind of bored and jaded when you get to the city this time, you were just amazed and delighted.
That's a recipe for. I mean, that's the empathy, I think, in the experience, getting to see it through someone else's eyes. It's cool.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that's cool. I love that. What did you call it again? What was the name?
Well, it's kind of a laser back in the sense that you laser to the remote thing and then you kind of wander back. But I still don't have the right word. It's not evocative enough.
All right, cool. It's good to have something to hang a hat on there. That's cool.
Right.
Yeah, I want to talk about writing and what that's been like for you. You've been writing for, I guess, almost 30 years now, huh?
Yes, and I have to say two things about that. One is I never wanted to be a writer, and two, I don't think of myself as a writer.
Okay. Well, how does someone...
I don't identify...
Let's take the first part. How does someone who never wanted to be a writer become a writer then?
Yeah, so I started off... well, first of all, in high school, I was kind of a science junkie. I doubled all the science and mathematics, which our college had.
I could see that.
And I had a chemistry lab that I built in my basement. Actually, when I was younger, I built a nature museum with exhibits and everything. So I was really into the
like you grew
science
your own.
and
You grew your own foliage and moss and stuff in the house.
yeah, I did all that. Preserving reptiles, catching. I had ultraviolet light displays on the minerals. I had demos of how birds' wings worked. Anyway, so I had all this kind of stuff, and I was a science kind of geek guy, but I also had interest in art, and I did a lot of painting and art projects and stuff, and I couldn't decide whether to go to MIT or art school, and I found some convergence between the two in photography, which was just kind of coming into its own. And I have to again remind my kids and other people of the state of photography in 1960s. Mm-hmm. People don't have any idea how rare it was. Yeah. So very few people had cameras beyond a little brownie camera for the household, and the typical camera had a 24 exposure roll, so that means 24 pictures. And typically, like our family would send in the roll. All the film had to be processed in Rochester, New York. It was all sent to one place to process, and it would take weeks and weeks before you got your pictures back. Oh, wow. But when those pictures came back in one roll, there were pictures of Christmas, Easter, and Halloween.
All together.
So I mean, all together. So basically, you took 3 pictures at Christmas and 2 at Easter. And that was about the rate that people were taking pictures. Mm. There was very, very few. And so photography was, and, if you had a fancy camera that you could kind of focus yourself, these were very, very few people had them, and to do that required a lot of technical stuff. Oftentimes the meters weren't built in. You had to figure these things out yourself. I got involved in, the chemistry and developing my own and printing them. That was the big thing, because if you wanted anything bigger than a little tiny thumbnail, you had to print it yourself. Mm. And I became really interested in photography as kind of an art thing, so I was doing larger format cameras on a tripod, higher detail, but it was all fairly technical, and very few people were doing it. And so, as I mentioned, I was really interested in photography and not so interested in college, and I went to Asia to photograph, and I bought 500 rolls of film, which was considered like literally an insane amount of film by anybody, because I took about, it was very expensive, and that's all that was in my backpack, by the way. I didn't have room for anything else. Wow. I mean, I had one change of clothes, and that was it, just 500 rolls. I mean, imagine a backpacker's backpack. That's how much room 500 rolls takes. Wow. And you couldn't buy film overseas.
Of course. Yeah.
So I had to bring it all with me. And I took about 2 rolls a day, 70 pictures a day. And 70 pictures today is nothing.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? Everybody takes on the phone. But when I told people then that I was taking 2 rolls a day, their jaws hit the ground. That seemed to them, again, to be a literally insane amount. It's like they could not imagine what you would do with 70 pictures in one day. What could you possibly have seen? And so, so anyway, the role of photography we had was a very different one than it does now. But what happened was, I started taking more and more pictures, and I would come back and work and to pay the money to be developed, because it was very, very expensive. Each time I clicked a shutter, it was about $1 or more in today's money.
Wow.
So imagine each time you click on your iPhone that it deducted $1.
It's a lot of pressure as an artist.
Probably $2. Yeah. So so it was very expensive, and I had to earn the money to get them developed. And the learning cycle was terrible, because it would be years before I saw what I took. So you couldn't see
Mm-hmm.
how the film did.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very, very laborious way to try to learn. But what came out of that was I started to write about captions. I started to write about the images. So my writing was first about what I was seeing, and then I really learned to write with the invention of the online world. I'm somebody whose telegraphic writing fit the contours of the emerging online world, and I was very early in getting access to online world because I convinced someone that I wanted to write about them as if it was a place to travel to, like a new continent, a new country. And I was writing about travel stuff, and I wanted to treat the bulletin boards and stuff in the early 1980, 81, 82, as if it was an emerging new country. And I got someone to get me online, and I found that my writing online fit. So I basically learned to write, or I was encouraged to write in online. And that's what happened. I started to report on more of what I was seeing in that kind of online voice that we all now find very familiar. But at that time, it was all new.
What is the online voice? What does that sound? I'm not actually connecting with what that sounds like.
Yeah.
Just kind of colloquial, like kind of...
colloquial, passionate, pithy, brief.
Not so academic or citations, any of that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So people used to tend to write in a very kind of literary way.
Yes, okay, yep.
Lots of allusions, taking time to kind of set things out, long, discursive, big words. But the online world was really just concerned about communication. So there was a little bit more of the emphasis and the reward of to the point, conversational, pithy, informed, opinionated. And so, which is now sort of the style, right?
Yeah,
I mean, but if you look at the kind of writing that was being published in the 80s and before, anything that made it into print, this has a different sensibility than what things do now.
And so this was perfect because not only were you, it seems like you were exploring technology like it was a different continent or a different world, and then you are also writing these captions, and it sounds like with a little bit of finagling and pitching, you found yourself kind of writing about technology in this kind of way. Is that what I'm getting from this? Is that
yeah? I mean, actually, so I was, things are a little more complicated, but I was editing. I see myself as an editor rather than a writer. But I was editing a magazine, but there was, I was very early on the internet, and one of the earliest, there was a notice being passed around on the internet when there was very few people there. It was mostly academics. There was a notice about an artificial life conference in 1987, I think, and it was like artificial life. That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, what is that?
It was at Los Alamos, and the guy basically was saying he didn't know what it was. Is if you thought you were working on it, come and give a paper. And remarkably, this incredible collection of people showed up, from Richard Dawkins to Jim Glick.
And you knew who they were
others.
At the time? Like you knew?
No, I didn't. I had no idea who was coming at all.
Oh, okay.
And so we all show up, and there was this conference, and then the variety of papers, ranged. I mean, they were just incredible. And what happened was, each talk, there was probably, over the couple of days, there were probably 30 to 40 talks. After each talk, I posted a summary of each talk on the well, on this online conferencing system that we started. And there was such a response within this very small internet world to those, which I was just reporting. I was like blogging or live blogging, which was what we would call it now, but nobody had really done that before. I think I was like the first person to do that. But there was such a response to it that that was the genesis of Out of Control. Was, oh my gosh, people responded to this, to my little writing. They wanted to hear more. So I decided to do a whole book around that theme of the convergence of living things and machines, artificial life. And so it wasn't like I was pitching. It was just like I was doing something in that kind of internet blogger way because I wanted to, or just because it was interesting to do. And then out of that came the response. So there's people want to hear more, so I'll do more. So it wasn't like I was trying to make a book or anything. I was just blogging my experience at that very formative conference.
So were you surprised then, how successful the book was, or was it successful at first?
The book was not successful.
It was not. Yeah. Okay. Now looking back, it seems quite successful, but
right. It was, but at the time it was pretty much ignored. There was a couple nice reviews, but no, it was way too early, and people just, it was released in '94, but I basically wrote it in 1990, 91, and it was before the internet.
Yeah.
And so it didn't. What I was trying to talk about didn't really make sense to people, the majority of people.
Yeah.
Only after the internet came along did it make sense. And it was recently, this book, Out of Control, was translated into Chinese 4 years ago. And it came into China at just the right moment because some of the earliest Chinese internet tycoons, like Pony Ma, Jack Ma, Alibaba, Alibaba, Tencent, these guys, they read it in Chinese, and it was very influential to them because by that time it was very clear what I was talking about, and they have heavily recommended it, and so it's become this huge bestseller in China. But that's 20 years after I wrote it. So in the U.S., it just came too early. The people who read it then, said it was very influential, but not very many people read it because it was too strange in a certain sense. It was talking about technology, and nobody was really interested in reading about technology until Netscape and the web, until the web came along.
So
and
like the late 90s, people... Because the first time I heard about it was I was actually in a philosophy of technology class, and we were studying The Matrix, and this is in 99, 2000 maybe. And and of course that it was like required reading. Was that for some of the actors to read Out of Control?
Right. So and I was always perplexed about what they saw in the book until I saw the third installment, and it kind of made sense.
Oh yeah. Okay. What was?
But
okay. I'm kind of curious.
The third one had this sort of swarming, the swarming architect at the end. That was a little bit more, related to the kind of hive mind that I was talking about in the rest of the book of Out of Control. So for the reader's benefit, one of the things I talked about was decentralized networks, hive minds, where there's no central intelligence. It's all distributed, peer-to-peer, how you can have things that are smarter than the parts, these emergent behaviors where very large complex systems are based on kind of lots of little dumb things connected together. Again, all of which didn't make any sense, but now when people hear it, they think about Uber and Facebook and all these other things, because that's what they're operating on. They're operating on the same kind of principles that I was talking about in Out of Control.
Yeah, and it reads well. I went back to it this week, just kind of, going through it. Funny enough, I found a CD-ROM stuck as my bookmark, which made me laugh.
That is pretty funny.
It's been a while. Yeah, but it reads really well, I think, especially because it has this element of just the way that, like, seeing the universe and seeing the similarities between nature and technology. And it doesn't necessarily just talk about any like one technology. Like, it's not just trying to, like, it didn't seem to me, at least, it didn't occur to me, it's just like forecasting like what the next 5 years are going to be. But there's like a deeper kind of like maybe symbiosis between like the ways that nature evolves and the way the technology evolves. And there's some truth in that's not necessarily just to be discarded. Like, it's very readable still.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that, because I was trying to write it to be kind of future-proof so that it would still be read and it makes sense in 20 years. And that was successful, although I think it did catch up sooner than I thought. And I tried to write my second book, The New Rules, with the same idea of not being too tied to the current .com. So I actually don't mention the word .com anywhere in the book, even though it was written during the .com era. I try to talk about things that would endure and what technology wants. The third book was actually also trying to write a book that might be appreciated in 50 years.
Yeah.
For the inevitable, I've lowered my sights a little bit down to like 20 years. I really wanted to talk about the time horizon of what kinds of things, what kinds of trends and forces would be at work in 20 years, but still, again, trying to take a longer view than just like what's happening tomorrow, and also not being, distracted by the specifics, like, whether it's Apple or IBM, which doesn't really matter. And I tried to again, look at large-scale trends as actually being probably more useful to people than, specific near-term predictions.
Yeah, and I sense that. So yeah, let's definitely talk about the inevitable. So it's coming out this week, which is very exciting. Congrats. And
thank you.
Yeah, right. And I noticed in reading it, it feels like, just to me, it feels like the last book, What Technology Wants. It definitely had that kind of like, it's a little bit larger of a book, and it's a little more academic. It's a little more philosophical. And this book, to me, it seemed like a user manual. Like, you could like read it and you have some like clear takeaways. I mean, it's bulleted, like there's 12 inevitable forces of technology, right? So I'm curious,
yes.
who was your target when you were writing it? Was there a specific person that you were writing it for?
There often is. The true answer in this case is that a lot of this material has, in this book, had been through a very heavily edited process, because it, in earlier forms, appeared in Wired or the Smithsonian or the New York Times Magazine. Some of it just appeared on my blog, but a lot of it had been processed pretty heavily. So I tend to write first, and this is kind of hard to explain, but first for myself, because I don't know what I think until I write it. For me, writing is a way for me to figure out what I think. So, like the AI or the VR is like, I don't know what my opinion is. I don't know what ideas I have about it, and even until the moment I sit down and write out the first draft, I don't know what I think. And so writing has, for me, become a tool to access my own thoughts. And so that's the first draft is sort of written for me as the audience. It's like, okay, what do I think? The second draft is a little bit more aimed to what I would call my colleagues, just in a general term, the circle of people that I respect. So I am trying to tell them something they don't know, and they're very well informed. So I try really hard by kind of like editing out obvious stuff. So whatever, I try to talk to almost maybe even people in the industry in the sense of, can I say something that is actually that they would find useful,
mm-hmm.
that they would find pertinent or insightful. And so the person that I'm not writing to is often the typical person, say, a newspaper's writing to, which is what they call the 11th grader, high school person. So they're kind of like talking to the everyman or to their mom, but I'm not talking to them. I'm talking to me and then to my colleagues. And when we were doing Wired, by the way, my assignment, when I was making the assignments to the writers, and they would ask this question, and I had a very clear answer, which is, you have only one audience, and that is me. And I'm well-read and bored, and you have to amaze me, nobody else. And so that's,
I like that.
I think that's a pretty high bar in a certain sense. But I think that was part of the attraction of Wired, is that we were talking up to people, not down to them. We were using language that we weren't explaining and stuff, and which was very contrary to the TV news or whatever.
Yeah. So when you say the inevitable, what do you mean by the inevitable? What is inevitable?
Yeah. Right. So that's a red flag word that is controversial in itself. Mm-hmm. Even the notion that anything could be inevitable. And there's a strong interpretation of it, and I'm using it much weaker. The strong one would be like, if you rewound the tape of life, you would wind up sitting in the same chair you are right now today, doing the same thing. That that it's kind of like there is this destiny,
like a fate,
fate,
yeah.
And that it's in its details. Mm-hmm. And the weaker version is along the lines that there is a bias to technological systems, as I was explaining, that as a system itself, any systems have certain urges and tendencies, and as you do them independent of where they're going, that there are certain things that they will kind of recur, happen again and again, and that those tendencies tend to drift the behavior in certain directions. And it's a direction. It's not a destiny. It's just kind of a general directional drift. And I use it in that sense that which we have seen in the past in many technologies, that there's almost like a developmental sequence mm-hmm. to technologies that you have to have kind of, obviously you have to invent electricity before you can have a telegraph, and then the telegraph probably comes before the telephone, no matter which planet you're on, in a certain sense.
Sure.
And that certainly independent of what country it's in, and we know that some studies of prehistory inventions, that they've kind of generally formed a sequence of, people do pottery before they do domesticated animals and things like that. So I would say, I'm using the word inevitable in the way that I would say, once you invent electricity stuff, the telephone was inevitable, but the iPhone was not. So the large forms of things like quadruped in biology, quadrupeds are inevitable just because of the physics of physical things, four legs,
yeah,
very stable, and that therefore in the world of robots, quadruped robots of some form are inevitable, but the specifics of what they look like, what they run on or not.
So for example, yeah. So I was just trying to relate an example. Like one that comes to mind is in the book you say you have one inevitability. It's called screening. And so in this case, you're saying like screens are inevitable. It's inevitable there'll be more screens, more ways to interact with technology beyond just maybe the keyboard. I'm kind of riffing here. But it's not necessarily inevitable who's going to own those, whether it's corporation or government or whether it's open source. That's the kind of distinction of inevitability you try to draw, right?
Right.
Okay.
So the specifics and particulars, the character, are very much unpredictable, very unpredictable. And secondly, they're very much under our control. We have choices. And thirdly, they make a huge difference to us. They make a huge difference to us. And so we have a lot of room for choice in determining what these technologies look like, even though the larger forms of them are inevitable. So the light bulb, the incandescent light bulb, was inevitable, and we know in part because there was 23 other inventors of the electric light bulb before Edison.
Right, I heard that.
Edison was the 23rd person to invent it. So he wanted to be invented. I mean, it was going to be invented somehow or other. It was the right time. And Edison triumphed because of marketing skills, because he actually, or other user interface thing. He devised not only the bulb, but the whole system that worked.
Yep.
Just like Facebook was not the first social media, Amazon was not the first online bookstore, Google was not the first search engine, so on. They are known, remembered, and succeed because they got other things, the particulars, just in the right way that we wanted them. And so those particulars make a big difference. They're not predictable and not inevitable, and we have a lot of choice in them. And that's, again, makes a big difference to us. And so tracking more tracking is inevitable. Every year we track more and more of our lives. We self-track with the Quantified Self, something I had a role in starting. We are tracking each other with photographs that we tag our friends with. Companies are tracking us either voluntarily or opt-in or opt-out. Governments are tracking us, and often we don't even know it. People don't realize that every piece of mail you send to the U.S. postal system is scanned front and back. The front and back of your envelope is scanned, is tracked. So that's happening now, and there's nothing I see in the future that will diminish the amount of tracking. We're just going to be tracking more and more and more and more of our lives, and then 30 or 40 years will be basically totally tracked. And by the way, virtual reality worlds, which I'm a big proponent of, I think they're also inevitable, is a totally surveilled world. By definition, the way that they do virtual reality is they track every single motion. They'll be backward-facing cameras looking at your face, tracking the micro-expressions so they can convey that to your avatar. And everything that's very hard to track in real life will be trivially easy to track in VR, and people spend a lot of time there. And so VRs will be kind of worlds that you voluntarily surrender to be totally surveilled in. These things are, at that level, inevitable. So more tracking is inevitable. What's not is, what is the regime? What's the privacy regime around this? What's the legal regime? How do we domesticate it? How is it civilized? What does it feel like? Who owns the data, etc.? All these many, many, many questions of which are not predictable and are decided by us.
Yeah.
So tracking, the one thing that we do know, or that I feel like I do know, is that we can't stop it. We can't prohibit it. We can't outlaw it. We can't turn it back. We have to, like copying on the copy machine, the internet, we have to work with it and make it, and domesticate it, make it civil. But we will not be able to prevent it from tracking us more.
So in the book, I kind of read it through the eyes of, I have a business, I have a startup, and I kind of read it through the eyes of things that potentially, I'm always creating, I'm always interested, and I'm talking to a lot of people in that world. I took it as like ways that I could start to, I guess, move my own creative ideas and saying, hey, these are inevitable things like tracking, things like screening, and like takeaways for business. Was that one of the intentions? Like, was it a business book? Did you write it that way, or did I just kind of read it that way?
It's cast as a business book, but I've never thought about it as a business book, and I don't think my audience, I think of it as a business audience. I think it happens to be useful, but I don't think that was my main intention.
Yeah.
Wired, which we didn't get to the genesis of Wired, but Wired was, first of all, it was a magazine that we made that we wanted to read. There wasn't a magazine we wanted to read, so we made the magazine that the founders wanted to read. And part of the way we had of explaining Wired in the beginning was that, Rolling Stone, it's not really a magazine about the music, it's about the culture of the music. And Wired was really not about the technology, it's about the culture of the technology. So my interest is really about the culture of technology, or the larger culture, not just the business culture. And while I'm happy and and aware and did put in the business implications, I wanted or hoped it to be broader. Although I think by definition people tend to slot talk about technology into the business realm. I think that your larger point is true, though, that what I wanted people to, my larger message is that I want people to embrace these things that are coming, because I think that only by engaging them can we steer them. I think we can't steer them by prohibiting them or outlawing them or trying to stop them. That doesn't work, that we want to embrace and engage, and that embracing and engaging also is a way that we can maximize their benefits and minimize the harms, that we can actually prepare to get the most from them. And so I wanted people, basically to rehearse in preparing to make the most of these, because they're going to come, and whether that's in their business lives or their individual lives or education or politics. If you kind of accept that tracking is only going to increase over time, then what do you do? If you can accept the copying will just never go away, if you can accept the fact that AI is coming, and while it will displace jobs, you can't stop that by trying to outlaw AI or regulate. That's the wrong level of working. VR interactions are going to come. You can't stop them. Then how do you work with them? How do we engage? Because that's where we're going. So be ready, be prepared to maximize their benefits, minimize our harms.
Yeah, acceptance is a really good word. I think I felt that throughout. And I noticed that you also suspend judgment throughout. It's pretty much like, this is the way things are and this is the way things are going. Is there a side of you that holds back or has, the dangers of these technologies getting in the wrong hands, privacy? Like, does this come into your mind and you hold back? Or are you maybe planning, have you ever thought about writing a kind of critique of how we're either using or abusing some of these technologies?
Well, I make only a small reference near the end to the fact that, and I spent a little bit more time in the previous book about the negative aspects, but what I do say is that I'm not a utopian, I'm a protopian, meaning that I don't think that there's a kind of a place that we get to where there's harmony and all these things are good. I think that, a large portion of most of the problems we have today are caused by previous technologies, and in the future, all the things that we'll be concerned and worried and upset and legitimately worried about are going to be technologies that we're inventing today, but that the net game that we're creating 1% more than we destroy, and that's sufficient. But the point about and there's never been a technology that we haven't learned to weaponize. So that seems like, well, that's going to happen. So I think the only thing I wanted to say about the reason why I don't dwell on that is because I think all of the ways in which these things are going to be abused with the same dynamics. So the same dynamics apply of sharing, flowing, cognification will apply to the ways that it's abused. So the criminal networks will use the same forces. They're going to have to obey the same general trends of cognification and sharing and all these other things. So they apply whether they're negative or positive. And so I don't really, I just feel that there's plenty of other people who are totally worried about the negative effects, but I don't think I think they're real, and I think they'll have effect, but I think it doesn't change my argument that these trends, because they're going to affect even the criminal hacker outlaw as well, and we need to embrace them either way.
Yeah.
We need to engage them either way. The negatives will be there. We'll try and pay the price, but each negative is actually an opportunity to make a new technology. So I have a very technocentric view, which is that the solution to the problems that technology creates is not less technology, but more and better technology. And so in that sense, which will also follow that, so in that sense, the fact that there are negatives doesn't change our stance. Yeah. Which is that we should embrace them and engage them, because it's by engaging that we'll deal with them. So that the catalog of all the bad things, I just don't feel like I need to repeat, because there's so many people. This is what journalists is the first thing journalists want to know. There are so many people paying attention to how bad it can get that I'm bored by that, and I feel like I don't need to even catalog that, because they're doing a good job.
They're doing it.
I just want to emphasize the fact that to maximize the benefits, we need to engage with them and these technologies and these trends, and that whether or not you want to deal with the negatives, because they're going to use the same trends, so you need to know what they are.
I love it. No, that's great. That makes a lot of sense. That's awesome. I just wanted to close. I know that you love books. I heard on the Tim Ferriss podcast recently that you gave the advice to read 10 books a year and it would change your life. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. How many books a year do you read? I'm just curious. A month?
Oh, well, so there's different kinds of reading.
Okay.
In fact, a book that I do this book called Cool Tools, which is a meta book. It's like a huge catalog of possibilities, and it lists all kinds of tools, many of which are books. And one of those books that I recommend is called How to Read a Book. Huh. And by Mortimer Adler, who actually was one of the inventors, designers of the great Books of the Western World series, this canon. And his idea of how you read a book is basically you kind of you read through it really fast the first time, you kind of go through making notes and research the second time, and then the third time you're kind of synthesizing. So for him, you haven't read a book unless you've done that to it. So there's that level of reading, which, I may do only a couple books a year on that. Then there's kind of I actually turn the pages all the way through the book, one. And then there's, which is, some dozens of books a year. And also I listen to a lot of books, primarily my fiction. I am a big Audible fan and have been for almost 30 years. Oh. And then there's the books that I read by going through very, very fast. It's not even it's faster than speed reading. It's sort of skimming through, looking for the parts that I can steal. basically, and
Okay.
dog eel. And so those would be in the hundreds. And then there's another level, which books that I inspect and I read the first and last chapters. And, there'll be maybe hundreds of more of those. So I think, I don't know if I answered your question about how many.
So maybe you read. Oh, what I took away from that is that you read books in different ways. So there's not just one way of reading a book. And then it sounds like a few hundred a year. I don't know, something like that.
Well, I mean, by appearances, they would be on my shelves, and so I would have some knowledge about them or some opinion about them, even if they weren't based on very much. And part of this came out of reviewing the stack of books that come in for review or blurbs or whatever it is. And there is a kind of a holistic tenor or sensibility to a book. And the thing of being able to look at the first and last chapters and maybe a random page in the middle is that I would say that really is a good test for me in terms of whether I want to spend more time with it. I can pretty well tell the density or the thickness or the richness, maybe that's the word, the richness of the brew. I have, I would say, certainly 80% of the books are just too dilute for me. Too thin. It's just not worth my time. I use jokingly not enough for me to steal from, which is sort of my measure of like, can I take anything away? And so they may work for other people, but they're just not working for me. And so a lot of what it's doing is kind of, is triage of trying to find the ones that I really want to sit down and go through. And so they're far and few between. And occasionally there's somebody where, I'll be dog-earing every page. And that's and there's not too many writers, but there are a few writers who can do that for me. And a couple books here and there where, it's just, and that's what you kind of dream for is a book that does that.
Is there any one book that you've ever wished that everyone in the world would read and the world would be a better place?
Well, I have to say this very carefully, but I think the Bible for a couple of reasons.
Tell me.
One is most people who have an opinion about the Bible have never read it all the way through. It's a far more disturbing, amazing, annoying, enlightening book than most people realize because they've never read it all the way through. And yet it purports to be the foundation of Western culture. There's huge cultural wars. There's people that are saying things about it who may have not even read it themselves. And I just think people would be better informed, including to argue against other people quoting it, if they would actually read it through once. And it is just as a literary document, kind of an amazing document just on that level.
All right, that's another episode of On Books. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Kevin Kelly. So if you're interested in The Inevitable, I recommend you pick it up. I'm also going to, in the next episode of On Books, just cover briefly, I'll read from it a bit, and I'll cover briefly some of my favorite takeaways, so stay tuned for that. And also, if you've been listening to the show, or if you're new to the show, you might know that we've been doing the Social Good series. I've been putting together a series of books for social good that I found inspiring to do more good in the world, and we will be getting back to that. We'll also be having Peter Singer on the show, and a bunch of other people. Actually, have been getting quite a lot of requests and attention of people that want to get involved, so that's been really exciting. So that there will be more of that coming. Yes, that will be happening. So I hope you're excited for that as well. If you like On Books, you know what you can do? Let me tell you. You could subscribe because that's something you can do and it would help the show. On iTunes, you could also write a review if you like it. That also helps. And help spread the word. I am on the Twitter at OnBookShow and the Facebook /OnBookShow, where you can get the latest episodes sent to you. There's also the website on-books.com, and there are tons of books from the past that I go and search for, like that kernel of knowledge in the book, and try to bring that to you. That's the larger mission here, is getting you excited about books, and hopefully less than 30 minutes each week. So there's a ton of books that we've looked at already, like Letters to a Young Poet, Mindset, it's about growth mindset, Mating in Captivity. So there's a bunch on iTunes for free for you to check out. I hope you check out those if you do and you enjoy it, or if you don't enjoy it. Either way, you can write me. I am Chris at on-books.com. Oh, and kind of dirty news, but I finally got the domain youtube.com/Castig, Castig, where YouTube let me, I finally got that name and I could finally share my videos in an easy way. Before that, it was like a 22-character horrible long name. So now it's just youtube.com/Castig, and you can also check out my videos. So a lot of stuff there. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Let me know what you think. Feel free to write me, and have a great week. Read The Inevitable. It's good. It's really good.